Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute or so. While we're waiting, I wanted to welcome everyone to the Signal Legibility BD Assist and Anchor Node webinar, part of the LSN Bootcamp series. Behind me, you have my happy face friend, and the reason he's so happy is Resi San Diego is right around the corner during convention week. Oh, you can't see him. Let's have him turn around a bit. And he's happy because he's coming to have a ton of partnering meetings that are going to help get his company funded and get its cash runway extended, help its chasm the famous Death Valley, and get from preclinical to clinical. So come join us at Resi San Diego on Monday, June 22nd, in person, alongside the International Convention, followed by virtual partnering on the 23rd and 24th, and then extending into the next week for the 29th and 30th. A great way to extend your convention week and Resi partnering activities in the week after convention, where everyone's schedule calms down a bit. So, welcome to the webinar, and we'll get started. I'm joined by my colleagues Max and Karen, and they'll introduce themselves in just a second. But I wanted to welcome everyone and again explain that my happy face buddy behind me is happy because we're entering convention week, Resi San Diego, a ton of partnering meetings and investor meetings are on the books for all attendees. There is still time to capitalize on logging into the system and securing a bunch of investor meetings. A lot of the activity happens in the last week before the meeting, and Resi San Diego is going to be the number one place during convention week to meet with early stage investors. Those are investors who are seeking life science companies who are raising seeds, Series A or Series B. There will also be a ton of external innovation scouts from large pharma companies there looking to really learn about your early stage company, platform, asset, whatever it is, and start to build that relationship with you. So when it's time for a licensing deal, they already know you. And of course, I wanted to also introduce Resi Boston. Many of you have already attended a previous Resi Boston, September 22nd and 23rd. It'll be a 2-day Resi Boston, so even more chances to get your partnering meetings in. And virtual partnering will follow that on the 25th, 28th, and 29th. So the Resi conferences are the largest investor conferences, excuse me, by the number of attending investors. And if you are a fundraising company, it is madness not to attend. Um, Resi San Diego on the Monday, just so everyone is aware, starts early in the morning, and bio partnering starts in the afternoon. So if you are attending bio, it's likely you won't have any partnering meetings on until Monday afternoon, and Monday is usually the lightest date. So there's really no conflict with Resi. So if you're wondering, can I attend both bio and Resi? You absolutely can, and you absolutely should. There's nothing better than starting your bio convention with a whole bunch of investor meetings already under your belt. It gives you the confidence to really succeed in those conversations you'll have at bio if that's your plan. So I'm joined by Max Braht, Vice President of Business Development at Life Science Nation, and Karen Deyo, Vice President of Product Management at Life Science Nation, and they'll be going through the presentation. My name is Shigato Das. I'm the President and COO, and I'd like you to encourage you to take this opportunity to scan this QR code and register for Resi San Diego to get the most investor meetings you can and the biggest ROI on having those leveraging your time in San Diego, your time and money that you've already spent to be there by getting those investor meetings. So again, Resi San Diego, Resi Boston are available as a bundle, believe it or not. So you can take advantage of that to get some great discounts and also take advantage of this discount code you're seeing here for $500 off the 5-day Resi San Diego experience or $500 off the bundle. Also, Resi San Diego has two other attendance options. One is virtual partnering only, so you can excuse me, you can participate in the virtual partnering days only, and you can use this great discount code for $200 off of that. Or you can stop by without access to the partnering system in person, and that's called audience access. And you can also use this a discount code to get $200 off of that. And audience access is really valuable because the investors at Resi conferences wear a red badge, so you can easily identify them. And then you could always uh, outstretch your hand and introduce yourself and see if that's a investor that's interested in your modality and indication and move on from there. So it's a great way to go and even without partnering meetings, um, leave the conference with 10 or 12 meetings under your belt. So I would take advantage of that if I were you. Also, I wanted to give a quick introduction to some of the other offerings that Life Science Nation provides besides the Resi conferences that you're already very familiar with. One is our Life Science Nation investor database that has over 4,000 very detailed profiles of investors that you can quickly search through to find those that are best matches for your indication, your modality, your stage, your geography, the amount you're raising. And it contains full contact information. The detailed profiles in it are based on interviews we actually do with investors. It's not just web scraping, so it really gives you the inside baseball to understand what the investors want, what kind of materials they want from you, and who to contact. So it basically reduces what would take you probably several years to find out to several minutes. So get a list of 400, 600, 800, even 1,000 investors that are great fits for you in minutes, and then begin reaching out to them and really have a great campaign ready to go within an hour of subscribing to the database. We also offer entrepreneurial educations through LSN Labs. And through this program, we have helped probably hundreds, if not thousands, of companies accelerate their fundraising journey and discover how to go from being a scientist to an entrepreneur. Usually, we work with economic development agencies, associations, biotech clusters, and so forth, who work with us to send us their brightest and best companies that we send through our LSN Bootcamp program. So if you are such a organization, please get in touch with us. We have a track record of helping companies raise literally hundreds and millions of dollars, and that's based on their reported fundraisers back to us. We even have a white paper on it based on a number of companies we helped in Australia. These are just a small snapshot of all the investors you can normally find at our conferences from across 10 different investor types. So again, we are the biggest life science partnering conferences by the number of attending investors. We also encourage you to apply to pitch at Resi. Resi has a unique pitching format where you pitch directly to a group of well-aligned investors, investors who are specializing in your modality and who actually are obligated to interact with you and share feedback with you. So you're not just presenting to an empty room. There is a guaranteed panel of well-aligned investors, as well as an audience in the room that has many more investors and in-licensors in it. So just scan this code for IPC. Finally, some great free complimentary, I guess they mean the same thing, offerings from us. The investability report. This is based on 12 years of us teaching fundraising and incorporating that into a generative AI model that simply asks you to fill out some simple questions, upload your deck, and it gives you an incredibly detailed analysis of what you need to do to improve your deck, what are your strengths, weaknesses, what are the opportunities and threats for your company. Go to go.lifesciencenation.com/LSN Labs car and do it. There's no reason not to. It's free, it's instantaneous, and it'll give you some great insights on your company and your pitch. And finally, contact me or Karen or Max, but my email is right here, s.das@lifesciencenation.com for some free investor tips. So we'll listen to you tell us about your company for a few minutes, and then we'll query our database to see some great fit investors that are well aligned with your company that you probably have not heard of before and are not on your radar, and we'll share their profiles as well as contact information with you. So no reason not to take advantage of that. So please do reach out. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleagues, Karen and Max, who will introduce themselves and jump into the webinar. So Karen and Max, over to you.
Thanks, Shigato. Hi, everyone. My name is Karen Deyo, and I'm the VP of Product at Life Science Nation, which basically means I help and organize new product development. I run our educational content. And if you have come to our Resi conferences, then you know I also do a lot with the partnering platform, and you've probably seen multiple emails from me in that regards. Max?
Hi, everybody. My name is Max Braht. I'm the Vice President of Business Development at LSN, which means that I get the privilege to actually engage with a lot of the companies. So, therapeutics, medical devices, diagnostics, digital health, and lastly, biotech R&D tools. LSN is life science specific. We are focused on early stage companies. And part of what our BD team does at LSN is not only get companies geared up and ready to engage with the Resi conference and with our database and teach them how to use these tools properly. But most importantly, our job is to help companies think of how they can approach fundraising. And so that's really what a majority of this webinar today is going to focus on is for companies who are either new to fundraising or maybe you come from an experienced background but you're new to early stage fundraising. How do you shift into the mindset of I'm a scientist now becoming a CEO, executive fundraiser, because a lot of it is like speaking two different languages. And so, what this webinar again is going to be bridging that gap. And so, Karen, I think you have the slides that you'll pull up. Um,
Yep.
but thank you everyone for joining us, and we're looking forward to getting started.
Yeah, and I would also just add, feel free to raise your hand or put a question in the chat or the Q&A. We like this to be interactive, so don't hesitate to ask any questions at any point in time. And yeah, this is really just about making sure you are heard in the right way. If you attended the webinar that our CEO Dennis did last week, then you know he talked a lot about how to structure your pitch deck to really appeal to investors. And what we're going to talk about here is really, making sure that you position yourself in a way that you get actual signal and not just, platitudes or polite praise, because making sure that you can identify the difference is important. I like to, occasionally refer to myself as a lapsed scientist. So I spent about a decade in the lab before deciding that it was no longer for me. And I kind of came over to this side. And one of the things that I realized that makes this transition from scientist to entrepreneur the hardest is unlearning a lot of things that are taught to scientists that make it a lot more difficult to get on the same plane as an investor and answering the questions that they need answered.
Karen is also my translator because I am far from a scientist myself. And the beautiful thing about that is, in the world of life sciences, when you are generating value as a company, you will either design a trial, run a pilot study, generate tests, and get data. All of that is science. I can't speak that language, but the world of fundraising is entirely BD and sales. And so this first slide here walks through what is the initial kind of process that a company takes. And for most companies, it will start with leaving academia. So you've developed your technology, you've worked with the PI, and you've somehow gone through the grueling tech transfer process where you've now spun out as a company. The next stage is that they will typically join some sort of incubator and accelerator, and there are phenomenal groups out there. LSN works with a number of them, both within the Boston ecosystem, within the West Coast, and throughout the entirety of the world. I mean, we have great partnerships with a lot of incubators and accelerators. Their typical programming involves some sort of mentor, EIR, and their main role is to really shape the scientific story, right? So they can nudge you in the right direction of, are you potentially pursuing the wrong indication? How should you present the data? And they prepare you for really the step number one. But where LSN builds a lot of our true value is beyond just the development of a pitch deck and an executive summary and the initial materials. There's another 9 to 18 months of fundraising that I think most founders feel ill prepared for. And so they can leave these, and again, really promising accelerator and incubator programs, not knowing how to pursue the next 9 to 18 months. And the reality of that is it's a very different skill set than what you've typically been taught, right? 9 to 18 months of fundraising involves getting an investor list, canvassing that list to figure out, okay, who's actually a fit for my product, my stage of development, geography, my check size, and all of this key criteria, and then getting in front of those people. And that's much easier said than done. So we do understand it. But what we have focused both the Resi conferences and the investor databases to actually help you get in front of the investors because we've seen it time and time again. A lot of CEOs are phenomenal when they can get in front of the investor and they know how to tell their story. They know how to put it in a way that is really a compelling narrative, but they struggle to get in front of them. And so, Karen, I don't know if you have anything to add for that, but that kind of sets the context as to what both LSN's offering is, as well as just the purpose of this specific webinar.
Yeah, and the one thing that I would like to add is one, one of the biggest things we always encounter is a lot of people are always shocked how long a fundraise takes. And one of the biggest issues we face is that companies don't leave themselves enough runway. So that's always something to consider. It's probably going to take longer than you think. So start early, because the more time you have, the more you can do your work, do the due diligence, because it's not just due diligence on the investor's part, it's also due diligence on your part. And also, it's a change in thought process because when you're in academia, the questions that you would ask as a scientist are different from the questions that you're going to be asking as someone trying to make a marketable product. It's a different set of criteria. It's a different list of questions. So you need to know what the difference is, what the new questions are, and make sure that you're working to address them. So, and this kind of segues into the next slide where, you know, 90% of startups fail in the life sciences, and that's a pretty well-known statistic. But the truth is that most of these startups that fail don't fail because of the science. In a lot of instances, it's not that the science isn't valid, it's that either the company doesn't ask the right questions and isn't well prepared for the regulatory or reimbursement situation, or they have a solution that's looking for a problem, or they haven't properly queried the market and assumed that there would be interest when in fact it's not going to be as adoptable as they think, or it makes too big of a change in the current method of care that will make it so that doctors don't want to implement it. There's a lot of different reasons why technology is not a viable product. And the vast majority of them are not because of the science itself. And
Yeah.
so when you're starting a company, you need to think ahead of all of these potential failure points and make sure to do your research, because otherwise you're just going to end up, you know, going down the line maybe a couple of years and then realizing, well, I've put in all this capital and time and it wasn't even the right direction to go.
Yeah,
And that's
I
a
like this. Oh, sorry.
Go
I was
ahead.
gonna say I like this slide a lot just because the shock value of the 90% failure rate. Everybody knows it, but nobody wants to admit it. There is a 90% failure rate in the world of early stage life sciences. And like Karen said, it's primarily driven by the cause of the questions that are being answered by the company are not necessarily the questions that need to be answered, right? And so Karen had mentioned that, technology risk, and there's a variety of different components that can make a technology not viable. But beyond just that, there's a variety of different questions that can make a company not investable. So when you're an early stage company and you're going out and you're sharing your story, oftentimes one of the founder's traps is that you will obsess over the data and you will push out and talk about your technology. But an investor who is analyzing your company and they're reading it, they're doing so off of this concept that we have called a risk stack. And so the risk stack is essentially saying, okay, this is a neat, interesting technology, and there's bound to be a place for it in the market, but what other factors can prevent it from being an investable company? And so, is there a market risk? Is there a founder's risk? Is there technology risk? And all of these different kind of components of the risk stack that we'll talk a little bit more in depth within the next few slides. But it is essentially, how do you transition and translate what you're saying into the eyes of an investor that only cares about, are they an investable company along this criteria?
Yep. So we're all familiar with this. I don't know how many times I've run into companies that are stuck in this vicious cycle. It's always hey, I have this idea. I want to move it forward. I need some money to move it forward. And they go to an investor, and the investor says, "Oh, this is interesting. Come back to me when you have more data." And the founder says, "But I need money to get more data." But they're like, "Oh, but I need more data in order to invest." And so you're stuck in this cycle of you can't get out of this trap of I need money to get data, but the investors won't invest until you get data. And it can be very difficult to get out of. And one of the problems with this is that a lot of times if you start off with some non-dilutive funding, or if it comes from a technology transfer, um, it can happen that companies are founded prematurely when they haven't answered the basic questions that form that fundamental layer of the risk stack before actually going into like the legitimate fundraise. And so figuring out how to balance that, how to find alternate funding sources like non-dilutive funding, or being creative about the work that you can do and maybe get little bits of money to answer very small, specific questions that can answer or at least start to answer those questions within the risk stack can make it easier for you to get out of this vicious cycle. But it's something to be cognizant about, that when you're first doing your fundraise, make sure that you are going into it answering the right questions, and that you have put thought into those and getting answers to those questions while before you need to even, fundraise for your next round, because that will
Yeah,
be easier for you moving forward.
when you first start raising capital and you go out and you tell your story to a number of investors for the first time, that's one of the most valuable things you can do is get that market feedback. But it's also can be a little bit dangerous in the sense where it's important to not overanalyze a small subset of feedback and then generalize that across the board of fundraising. Because the reality is, and Shigato had brought this up a second ago, but there's 10 different categories of investors. So there is everything from angels, family offices, endowments, foundations, hedge funds, private equity, corporate venture, strategics. I could go on and on. Um, However, the reality is a small subset of those are really interested in early stage companies. And so we will hear, and especially I look at VCs and I'll use them as an example. Even within VCs, there's multiple different types. So there's late stage focused VCs who they do, growth capital for hiring a sales team, producing the product, manufacturing. Typically, that's much later, right? There's middle stage VCs who they do phase 2B and beyond. They want de-risked data, both on the therapeutic side and de-risked on the medical device side as well. But then there's a whole other subset of VCs that their theme is to take a relatively smaller amount of capital and spread it to a wider number of companies. And so they are the group that are looking for preclinical, in development type companies. And it can be really dangerous to go talk to a bunch of mid to late stage VCs and say, everyone tells me I'm too early, and then generalize that across the board. Um, because it's not always the case. So while the vicious cycle is certainly true and it should impact how you present your story, it's also important to note that in order to effectively fundraise, there's a huge importance on speaking to the right people.
And that's one thing that Max was saying is in terms of talking to a small sample size, this is also going to be true of anything that you put in your pitch deck. I don't know how many times we've talked to companies and they ask us for feedback on their deck, and we give them feedback and they tell us, oh well, I talked to so and so and they told me the exact opposite. So you're always going to get differing opinions. The key is to look for overarching themes. Are you being asked the same question over and over again? Does that indicate a gap that you need to fill in order to make yourself seem less risky? So the more people you talk to, the better you'll be able to tell what those themes are, which is also why it's absolutely crucial to have a large list of investors you're going after. 10 to 50 is not going to cut it. It's only when you start talking to a larger number of investors that you can really get a sense of what the feedback is.
And specifically, one of those most common feedbacks that we hear quite often is, oh, I'm too early, or oh, I'm not a fit because of XYZ, right? And oftentimes it's pretty generalized. Um, Most of the time it's just a polite no. And it's not necessarily even super reflective of the reason, right? We call that noise. Um, and what we're trying to do now is make that noise a little bit more legible, right? So when you've presented your company and you've refined your pitch deck, you need to do it in a way that is clearly read, right? And so investors, I use the metaphor of comparing it to a recruiting team when they look at a resume. They don't spend a ton of time looking at first materials, um, and they all prefer to see a different one, right? Some investors may prefer to see a pitch deck, others an executive summary, others a one-page tear sheet, but they want to be able to quickly skim through it and identify, okay, these are the different components that I'm looking for, and put a check next to it, right? And so the ability to present your information and your data in a way that's legible becomes increasingly important as you go out and tell it to more investors.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we're trying to put across, and again, when we're talking about legibility and speaking a different language, and the scientists speaking about the story of the science versus the risk stack, one example that I give about this is I had an opportunity a couple months back to see some companies that were pitching from South America, and it was a very interesting. We had one company that was doing a very interesting pitch talking about this technology they developed where they 3D print custom casts that were waterproof and breathable and would be so much better for patient quality of life while they had their limb immobilized. And it was a very interesting pitch, but their entire focus was on the science and the improvement to patient quality of life. And I'm watching this and I'm saying, okay, I'm not an investor, but if I was an investor, while this is all well and good, my thought is, well, how much more expensive is it than a standard cast? Does it require specialized equipment now to be in each emergency room or place where they do these, where they normally put casts on? Is it more expensive? If insurance are insurance companies going to be willing to pay for it? Because while, patient quality of life improvement is important from a human perspective, an insurance company will be thinking, do the reduced complications cost equal the difference in price from a standard cast to the new cast? And so, that's what an investor is thinking about. And that's what you need to think about as a company going to an investor. You can't just think about it from your perspective as a scientist and the patient because it's only part of the story. There are other parts of the story that an investor needs to have answered And if you're not answering those questions as quickly as possible, it might end up as a missed opportunity.
Yeah. Ultimately, what an investor wants to know is what am I getting in return for my investment? And the correct answer is they're getting a large portion of your company, typically, 20% plus. And the price that they're getting is discounted based off of the amount of risk, right? And so if they're going to be buying into your company and receiving 20%, but there's a 70 to 80% chance of failure, how can you present that in a way that shows, okay, the chance of failure is actually much lower, right? Not just because of the technology, but because of the milestones that I've achieved, because of if you invest, my Series A, it will get me to this next milestone and show what they're receiving in return. Especially with more institutional based investors, they're always going to be primarily ROI driven. And so at the end of the day, you have to translate what you're saying into the language of finance and return on investment for them.
Yeah. We actually have a really good question here with regards to what you were just saying, Max, where we have someone asking, can you please speak to the tension between raising a smaller amount of capital to achieve the very next product development milestone versus raising more significant capital to achieve a true value inflection point, specifically for a therapeutic development company? And this is a fantastic question that we see all of the time. Specifically because we frequently get companies that are, say, raising for the next 6 months. And that's one, it's kind of a waste of time because it takes so long to actually do a fundraising campaign that you're going to be going straight from one fundraise into the next, which is time consuming. We usually recommend fundraising for 2 to 3 years worth of milestones. And again, as Max was just saying, you're going to be handing over a significant portion of equity for every round you do because otherwise the investor's not going to feel like they get enough of a cut to actually make it worthwhile.
Yeah, I'll chime in there really quickly, Karen, if you don't mind.
Yes.
We've seen some people try to raise a smaller amount. They say, okay, I'm going to raise, and it's not a bridge round, but they say I'll raise a bridge equivalent sized round. And just ask for a smaller percent of equity to be handed out. Investors, that's a really tough sell because if they're trying to do something for 10% equity, especially at the early stage, seed or Series A, by the time the company actually reaches an exit point, whether it's IPO, acquisition, licensing, they're so diluted that it really minimizes any kind of potential return. And so the entire nature of the early stage fundraising is that they want a larger percentage of equity.
Yeah, and so for things like convertible notes or safe rounds, which is where you'll normally get those smaller rounds, in reality, a large chunk of them are usually filled by already pre-existing
Yeah,
investors,
that's a good point, Karen.
because they already have enough skin in the game that it's no real challenge. It's no real detriment to them to continue and add a little bit more money to add to their slice of the pie, as it were. But it can be very, very challenging unless you have an investor who's also already considering investing in your next round. And so it gets it, as Max said, it's kind of a hard sell, which is why we recommend doing larger rounds.
As well as I will mention, most rounds are going to be tranched, right? If you turn around and you raise 5 million, you're not going to get 5 million in one check the day that you sign it. It will come in terms of milestone-based payments. And so I looking back and reading your question, it says the next product development milestone. That can always be a milestone payment. But the way that we recommend sizing and creating the actual ask is mapping out your next 2 to 3 years of runway and essentially putting a price tag on each of the milestones associated with that until you get to the final key inflection point. And then add all of those up, and that's roughly your ask.
Yep. And that'll really answer a lot of the questions they have.
And doing it that way too, it bridges this gap because when you then turn around and you said, this is how I plan on fundraising, it's told in the story of investor and finance and ROI. And it gives you justification to why you're asking for what you are.
Yeah, and there's an additional question here about To what extent is there an appetite by investors and or strategic partners for a company pursuing a drug repositioning and or drug repurposing strategy? To be honest, a lot of therapeutics investors are not particularly interested in repurposing. They like new, like NCEs or new biologics or whatever it may be. There are a small subset of investors who do focus on repurposing because they like the reduced risk, but it can be a hard sell for a lot of investors, and it may take some convincing.
Yeah, it's also worthwhile when you have a product like either a repurposed drug or another, and I see this a lot with biotech tools. Um, when you don't specifically fit very neatly within one box, that opens the door to a lot of angels and family offices and other strategic investors in the sense where they're opportunistic. Sometimes they don't know what they want to invest in until they see it. Um, but this is the case with both a repurposed drug as well as any type of investment is IP and regulatory exclusivity. Those are both factors of the risk stack. And so whether it's a repurposed drug or you're creating and developing your own asset, the IP that surrounds it is going to be incredibly important. That's another factor of risk that could cause the company to potentially fail. So if you can present your data and your company in a way that shows that you might not have all the answers to everything right now, but you have a plan on getting there, that reduces the perceived risk by the investor.
So we've been talking about noise, and how to get true signal. And everyone here is familiar with noise. You probably have gotten it more than once, where an investor will say, "Oh, that sounds interesting. Come back to me at a later date, or I'll look it over," and you
We'll
never
review it
hear
and get
from
back
them.
to you.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you never hear from them again. We refer to that as polite praise. Anything that isn't followed by concrete next steps as noise. And the loop that a lot of people get stuck in is that they'll get the noise, they'll refine their pitch deck thinking that that's all they need to do, and then they just keep getting the noise where the one thing that you need to do is think about, okay, if I'm getting this noise, why am I getting this noise? What questions am I not answering that are leading to this noise, and how can I change that to an actual signal where they ask me to have a second meeting or send them a specific piece of data, or if they refer me to someone else, how can I change that? And a lot of that can actually be done by the startup itself by
Mhm.
changing the way you ask questions. When you have an investor meeting, don't just ask, "Are you interested or not?" Ask, "What would you need to see to be interested?" And by changing the way you're asking that question, instead of just a yes no answer, all of a sudden you're putting the investor in a position to give you valuable feedback on what it is that they think you're missing. And that's something that you can then that gives you an actual starting point of, okay, well, I can address this in this way, or I've thought about this and this is my strategy, and that will get you into a more engaged conversation. So, getting an actionable amount of feedback, a lot of that comes from the company itself and making sure that you are putting yourself in a position to actually receive that feedback.
Yeah. When it comes to fundraising, we always say that it's a numbers game. But just because it is a numbers game and because you need to go talk to as many investors as you can, doesn't mean that it's entirely transactional, right? The nature of communicating and speaking and working with investors is that it's very personal, right? And so much of that falls on the company to create signal beyond just a yes or no, right? And so if you speak with an investor that says this isn't a fit for us right now, some ways to turn that into signal is to identify, okay, when do I become a fit? If I'm too early, what key milestone do I have to hit to turn around and then become a viable investment option for you? And when you do get that answer, it's important to write it down, put a note in your calendar, and then when you hit that milestone, come back to them. Because one, it shows that you're consistent in your follow-ups, but it also shows that the company is progressing. And that's just one of many examples of how to, create signal. Another one that Karen had mentioned is a referral. And that's one of the most underrated things that you can get from an investor meeting. We all know that investors talk to other investors. They syndicate all the time, and even if they're not directly syndicating with each other, they're probably friends, they're probably former colleagues, and they know each other. And so we've seen it so often at Resi, where an investor has come to us and said, "Can you send me this person's email? I had a meeting with them. They're not a fit for our thesis, but I know someone who's really looking for fill in the blank." And then they've gotten a signal out of that, and that signal is in the sense of a referral.
And one thing that I want to add also is don't just think of an investor as a walking checkbook.
Yeah.
And that's actually part of a problem is that a lot of times companies have this expectation of walking into a meeting and walking out with a check. That's not going to happen. You're building a relationship and you need to think of it as building a relationship as one step on a very long road. And once you approach it that way, and not just in a transactional way, you're going to get a lot farther because investors are very familiar of being treated as a walking checkbook, and they don't like it. Like and there's the old joke of you walk into a meeting asking for a check and you get advice. You walk into a meeting asking for advice and you get a check. And that's not strictly going to happen, of course, but if you walk into the meeting as an opportunity to form a relationship, see if you're a fit, and potentially get some very useful advice, a lot of times you'll get a lot farther and make a much better impression on the investor and instead of just treating it as a sales opportunity 100%.
Yeah. And Karen, I think we unknowingly covered a lot of these in the last slide, but there are a variety of ways to get signal out of a meeting, again, beyond just a check, right? And so transitioning from polite praise and a compliment, that's not signal. However, getting a clear next step is.
Yeah, and you can't just do your pitch, sit back, and think that's enough. You need to follow up. You need to ask questions. You need to really go there, and you can't operate under the assumption that, oh, my pitch is fantastic. They don't need anything else from me. Your pitch is just your introduction. It's a movie trailer. Eventually, you're going to need to give them the entire picture. And that's one thing that you need to think about it is it's that this first meeting is just a first step.
Yeah. And oftentimes that is the case, right? So Karen and I have gone on and said polite praise isn't signal. Most investors are going to need to review your materials. So don't think that just because they say, okay, let's review this internally means it's polite praise and they're not interested. Um, what what you can do to create signal out of that is try to schedule a next meeting or certainly circle back to them, right? So if 2 weeks goes by and you haven't heard back, send them a message. Investors are very busy people, and so everyone likes to be reminded, everyone likes a follow up, um, and do so.
Yeah, I've never heard an investor complain about a follow-up. I've actually seen them thank companies for following up, which is an indication for you of, like the fact that it's not something that you need. So we have a question here about which is generally preferred by investors these days. Platform technologies that can generate multiple assets or one or two asset companies with a focused development plan. One thing I will say is that regardless of the type of company you have, you need to have a focused development plan. Even if it's a platform technology, we're going back to the de-risk stack. You need to get a proof of concept and de-risk the technology as soon as possible. And investors want to see you have focus. They don't want to see you developing five assets from that platform technology at the same time. So either way, you need to have a focused development plan.
Yeah, we see it a lot. We always recommend picking a lead asset and committing to it. It doesn't mean you have to take it all the way to phase three or take it to, the full extent, but at least pick a lead asset, prove that you can develop the asset, prove that the platform works, and then you can turn around and do it again with another asset if you want. Or at that point, you've probably given yourself enough leverage to turn around and actually sell the platform, whether it's licensing, acquisition. Um, a lot of times people will struggle trying to go immediately to their platform. One, it really narrows down the specific subset of investors that are interested. You essentially limit yourself to pharma, right? A lot of investors, real capital investors, want to see a lead asset, but it also just makes it a much more difficult sell.
Yeah. So again, it's not that single asset investor like investors will only look at single assets and not platform. The biggest turnoff for them is you're too focused on the platform and its capabilities and not in de-risking. Because again, it's always about the ROI, the risk versus reward for any of these companies.
Yeah. And multiple shots on goal is great. I mean, investors, pharma, they all love platform technologies, but not if there's so much chaos around developing nine assets that you can't fully develop one. That mitigates the point.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about taking as little money as possible to get as far along as possible, which is why they will also um, be looking into why you chose your first indication. Is it cheaper to develop? Is it not as crowded a space? Do you get a fast track for developing that one? There's always got to be a reason why you chose that indication first. And then it's all about getting the most bang for your buck as far as fundraising is concerned before you can either exit, out license, and move on to the next one or something like that.
So Karen and I are throwing a lot of information everyone's way, and we get it. And now we get to talk a little bit more about now that I know all of this, how do I then transition it and use it, right? And so in the world of private fundraising, it is actually pretty similar to what everyone thinks of with a standard IPO roadshow, right? So back in the day, and still, when a company prepares to IPO, they will sit down, they will spend, weeks preparing, buttoning themselves up, getting a new suit, doing all of the above to go out and raise capital globally. It's exactly what early stage companies are doing, just without a lot of the infrastructure that surrounds it, right? So they don't have a logistics team coordinating the travel, booking the follow-ups, handling their calendar, any of this. A lot of times it falls onto either the CEO, the founder, or one of the few employees. Um, we always do recommend that you can always get help from an intern, right? But it's still a small team. And so what's often overlooked is the ability to actually build your own infrastructure around this. And so one of the ways that we do that is we always recommend for companies to have a CRM, right? So both our database, we have one that is held externally on a web server that you can simply export into your CRM, or we also have a version of which that is managed directly in Salesforce.com. So it syncs with our backend and you can manage your investor outreach that way. But the important part of using a CRM is it allows you to track where each of your conversations stand, right? So we see it most often. First-time fundraisers will be using Excel, right? It's free and it typically comes pre-installed on your computer, so it's hard not to. But the issue is when a company is using Excel, it's typically a good sign that their fundraising and their investor target list is nowhere near big enough. Or they're going to drop the ball somewhere along the road. They're going to miss a follow-up. They're not going to be able to effectively track what materials have I sent them? When did I bump into them last? When did I talk to them last? All of this other important information that really is necessary to actually effectively build a relationship with that investor.
Yeah, I mean, I We used to have an internal broker dealer many, many years ago. And when we were doing fundraising on behalf of our clients, it was impossible to track all of the emails, all the meetings, the meeting outcomes in an Excel spreadsheet. It would have just been a complete mess. And so, in order for us to keep track of what we had done and what we needed to do, and for the client to be able to see where things stood, a CRM was absolutely necessary. And you don't want to drop any of those balls because it's a missed opportunity. And it makes a bad impression. The last thing you want is to have a meeting with an investor or meet them at an event and then meet them 6 months later and forget that you had met them, because they might remember you and then you've left a bad impression because they're like, yeah, I already met you. I don't need to, have you introduce yourself again. And so that's the sort of thing that you want to avoid. You want to make sure that you're making as good of an impression as possible.
Yeah, and Karen, I'll say something that I don't think you and I have said quite yet, but I certainly don't want to miss out on it, is fundraising is hard.
Yeah.
Um, it is a full-time job. It takes a lot of resources, time, and it's not an easy task, right? It's a very, especially because it's a very different skill set, right? So the ability to effectively organize, follow up, ping somebody, and handle all this logistics is difficult.
Yeah. We did get a question here about our opinion of using an investment bank or a registered broker dealer to facilitate investor introductions. So here's the thing about a lot of broker dealers, and this is kind of the reason that we got out of the game, is that to make it work, a lot of these investment banks, they'll sign up multiple clients, but they will only really focus on a small number of them. And those are the ones they put in the most effort into. And then the rest of them are just kind of sitting there, not really getting a lot of help, paying a lot of money every month and not really getting out of it. The reason that it didn't work for us is because we were transparent. We were showing exactly our efforts and putting in the amount of time that we were per client, and even making it so that they could see exactly what we were doing, but it's not cost effective on a small scale to actually be able to give that much individual attention per client, which is why we ended up closing it down. So I think that from what I've seen, and of course this is more anecdotally than written in stone, is that an iBank or a registered broker dealer is a lot more effective in the later stages, than it is in these early stages where it's a lot like once you're in the later stages, it becomes a lot more about the technology, the how far you are in the stage of development. Whereas in the earliest stages, it's really more about the personal relationship between the investor and the founding team, because that's what moves it forward. And the relationship between the team and the investor is a lot more important. And that's just not facilitated as well by an iBank or a broker dealer.
Yeah. And I don't know if this is the same person who asked the question a minute ago about repurposed drugs. But like Karen said, typical investment bankers and broker dealers, they get paid by the number of clients they take on. They'll take $10,000 a month as a retainer, and then they take 6% of the success fee. Um, However, only a small number of clients they can actually go out and get meetings for. Typically, those are the people with the more hot technologies, the hot indications, right? So you think back over the past 2 to 3 years in our industry, all of the GLP-1 drugs are going out and getting meetings, and all the repurposed drugs are kind of sitting in the back. So it can be tricky, right? And I would echo that what Karen says is important. It's not just the relationship between the founder and the investors, but it's also just a sense of transparency, which is why we did our investment banking practice the way that we did. And also what ultimately led us to building the database is the ability to give the company the tool and the infrastructure that you can see on the screen to do the fundraising themselves.
So to go back to it again, fundraising is a numbers game. You have to have a system in place. You have to have your messaging in order. You have to know that the investors that you're reaching out to are a good potential fit for you. You have to have a lot of meetings and you have to follow up. You can't just send out one email and pray. We've seen one of my favorite stories is someone who's come to a lot of Resi conferences. He's been involved in, I think, 17 startups, I think 8 or 9 of which have been unicorns. And so he's well known. And he's definitely not someone that you would think would be ignored. But he was trying to meet with an investor, sent him like 20 emails over the course of 6 months. Finally saw him at a networking event and went up to talk to him. And the investor was like, "Oh, yeah, I think I've heard of you." And the guy's saying in his head, he's thinking, "Yeah, because I sent you 20 emails. You've heard of me because you probably glanced at the email and then forgot about it." And so that's the sort of thing that you need to think about. Is it's not just going to be one email, and if they don't answer, they're not interested. You can't make that assumption until they tell you no. You have to keep trying to reach them. If it's at a networking event, at a partnering conference, sending a cold email, reaching out over LinkedIn, whatever it may be, you need to figure out a way to get in front of them to get an answer.
Yeah. Karen, you and I have a tendency to always run late on these. So I don't
Yes.
know if we'll make it through all the slides, but I'm going to make one more point and then maybe we open it to Q&A. Um, Fundraising is a numbers game, right? And back on the last slide, fundraising is a numbers game. One of the things that we do is we work with a lot of VCs and friends of the firm who are raising funds of their own. And every time we do it, we'll help them find LPs. And every time we do that, we always start by saying, show us the slide deck that you're going out and that you're pitching. And it's like this golden slide that all of them have, where it says, we look at and we source 600 to 800 companies a year to turn around and make 2 to 3 investments. And so the investors on the other side of the table, the buy side, they're playing the same numbers game that companies are. They need to go out and they need to talk to a ton of early stage companies, and they're also being kind of drowned in deal flow. And so following up isn't annoying, it's persistent, and oftentimes it's what it takes to get in front of the person. Don't confuse no answer with a no. Um, Wait, and like the story Karen had mentioned, wait until you can talk to the person and then turn that into signal.
Yeah, we have a great question here actually about, building a team is expensive. How do early stage companies ensure investors there's a qualified team to execute on the plan post funding? Are fractional executives or consultants or advisors sufficient? And this is a great question because absolutely you're right. Building a good team is expensive, but you don't necessarily need all of those components straight off the bat. And so you're going to build your team as your technology develops. You don't necessarily need manufacturing full-time CMC person right off the bat. If you're still pre-IND and you're getting some more, you need some more studies before you can even file for an IND. So think about, what makes sense for my current stage of development. If it's, oh, I spoke to such and such a consultant, or I spoke to such and such a CRO or CDMO, and they had these recommendations, and this is part of my strategy moving forward. Investors understand that you're not going to have a whole team right off the bat. And there's also something to be said for making this is also part of choosing the right investors, because in a lot of instances what you get, it's not just capital, it's smart capital, and you can rely on your investors and their networks and expertise to help you answer these questions early on without necessarily needing a full-time team member that is an expert in that area. And the investors know that the team will grow as the company grows and as you get closer and closer to achieving those milestones.
Yeah. Karen, I think you pretty much answered that question. The one thing that I will add is, yes, building a team is expensive. Um, Oftentimes some of the first employees, the founder or the co-founder, are working more for equity than they are salary. When you look at hiring, more of like a BD staff or even a fractional executive, typically they're paid. But oftentimes I've seen this worked into pitches before where you can almost incorporate that into your long-term strategy. And you should, but incorporate it in the sense where you can say, if I turn around and raise a Series A, part of that capital will be used to hire, a chief medical officer or a regulatory expert. Um, and that gives signal of your own. It allows you to show that you have strategy in place, and it answers the question for the investor as to whether or not you know how to proceed. Um, and I've seen that work well in the past, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing that I will caution against is make sure that whatever team you do have is well-rounded. You don't want them to be with the exact same skill set. You want to build complementary skill sets as you're adding to your team. Another question. What percent of a raise is reasonable to dedicate to G&A? Yeah,
G&A, I'm sorry, I don't know what G&A means.
I'm not familiar with that acronym as well.
We'll wait to see if we get the answer.
General and administrative costs, salaries, and wages. I think this depends on the round and what milestones you're looking to achieve. There's no hard and fast rule, because if your next stage is building, a team that is involved in the regulatory, or if you're building up your manufacturing, or if you're doing a certain number of studies just specifically to get an IND, then the distribution of the money is going to be it's going to vary. That being said, you need to know what the norms are in the industry for whatever it is you're hiring for, because investors don't want to see a large chunk of the raise going to general and administrative costs, and then a lot of that money is going into the pocket of the founders instead of moving the company forward. So you need to be reasonable with what you're assuming, with what you're trying to accomplish, and just look at what the industry standards are, what the average salary is for whatever role you're trying to hire.
Yeah, I what Karen said is right. I mean, there's no hard and fast rule, but I will say it's probably going to be a very small percentage. If you're getting a check from an investor, the purpose of that check is to move the company forward, and so it is difficult to justify. I'm raising, especially at an early stage, say seed round, justify a seed raise where a large percentage of it goes to administrative costs. Rather, at the very early stage, think tech transfer, pre-seed, and seed. That's almost always going to be the founders and the early stage employees working for equity. As you develop and hire more staff, maybe in a Series A or a Series B, C, then it becomes more easy to factor that into a raise.
Yeah, and I would really look at, other people in the industry, chat with other people that they can kind of direct you to what is reasonable, if it's going to be a full-time role or if it's a part-time role given your stage of development. It really depends on where the money is needed to de-risk the company.
Karen,
Okay.
do you know if were our emails on that first slide?
I do not believe they were, but why don't we put them into the chat? so that people can absolutely reach out to us and answer any questions you may have. We will be putting in sharing the recording and the slides as a follow-up, so you will be able to look through. And we'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. But that being said, keep in mind that your best signal is just get out there and talk to as many investors and strategics that you can. Find out people who have the knowledge of your industry, and get their opinion because they're the ones who will give you the best advice on how to move forward.
Yeah. I completely second what Karen says, and I'll add to it by saying if you're going to be in San Diego for bio, maybe you're there to take partnering meetings with pharma or CROs, CDMOs. Maybe your state's regional organization is bringing you. If you want to go there and your focus is to meet investors, Resi is going to be the place to be. And so if you're already out there, we're doing Resi San Diego on Monday. Monday, June 22nd, so this upcoming Monday. If you're not already signed up, please do so, right? It's not too late to get into partnering quickly and send some last minute meeting requests, or we have an audience access pass for, $500 it gets you in the door. So we certainly hope to see everybody there. If not, we hope to see everybody in Boston in September for what will be a really big event for us. We'll have 2 days of in-person partnering and probably 350 to 400 investors there.
Max, I think you only shared our emails with hosts and panelists. So if you want to make
Uh,
sure to send it to everyone, that would probably
Yeah,
be
that might work
helpful.
better. I think Karen has my email already. I'm gonna send these one more time. So I'm just sending Karen and I's emails in the chat to everyone. And so you have mine, you have Karen's. We will be sending, you'll get an email likely from me with both the recording and the slides. And I'll also include the QR, which has Shigato's email. So if there's any questions that anybody has for any of us, or if you want to fill out that company fundraising report, please do. It's free. We're happy to help. Um, and we look forward to seeing you guys at a future Resi event.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I mean, we're all here we want to make companies succeed. That's what we want. That's why we do this, because we know that it has the potential to help a lot of people. And so we want to help you get to where you need to go. Okay,
Perfect.
Shigata, did you want to say anything or should we wrap this up?
I think I just echo the comments that you and Max made. We look forward to seeing you at Resi. Knock out your investor meetings at Resi. You'll find all the early stage investors there. And safe travels to San Diego and back. Great job, guys.
Thank
Great.
you,
Thanks, everyone.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.